Hey everyone, welcome to SFL Live. This week it's just me and Dr. Roderick Long who will be speaking. He's already spoken at, I think, two SFL conferences this semester, and then
Three.
also one in three, right? Because one in Europe,
Yeah.
right? And are going to be speaking at your fourth this weekend at the Oklahoma Regional Conference, which is going to be anarchism, all about anarchism.
And you'll be
Uh,
there too.
yes, I will. I will be there. I'm going to be talking on a panel about prison abolition, which will be fun. So I just want to do the show, and we can talk about the conference and what you'll be talking about there. And I also want to take the opportunity to sort of do like kind of an AMA style thing, because you're pretty popular in the movement with your writings and your papers and everything. And so a lot of people had a lot of questions that we wanted to ask you. So I asked a lot of people on Facebook and Twitter, and I got some questions. So do you just want to start? I can start. Go ahead and ask you what
Okay.
people want. Okay, cool. So I'll say, I guess, the person who asked it, and then the question. So first one is from Max Lefebvre, who's a former SFLer, and he wants to ask, you're very popular, you're known for your work on virtue ethics and eudaimonists theories. So Max wants to know, what metaethical theories do you think are compatible with virtue ethics?
Well, I think quite a range. Oh, I need to mute myself. I'm hearing my echo. What do I
Oh,
need to do?
I didn't hear anything. I can mute me. Sorry, because I don't have a mic. I don't have headphones, so I'll mute myself when you talk. Then so I'll mute and you can go.
Okay, thanks. So, I mean, historically, a lot of different people have, with very different metaethical views, have been some kind of virtue ethicist. So, for example, David Hume, who was metaethically pretty minimalist. I mean, exactly what his metaethics was is tricky, whether he's an anti-realist or what. But at any rate, he was pretty minimalist in his metaethics, and yet he was a virtue ethicist. Then at the opposite extreme, Aquinas was pretty maximalist in his metaethics, and was a virtue ethicist. And then you have people like the Confucians, where it's hard to know exactly how to describe their metaethical position, but their whole metaphysical framework is pretty different. And then you've got Plato and Aristotle, where Plato's got something like the form of the good ultimately backing up everything, and Aristotle has nothing like that, but he's got he's got a fairly robustly metaphysical account of human nature. So yeah, I think that there are a lot of different metaethical positions that are consistent with it. I lean more toward a kind of a naturalized Platonism or naturalized Aristotelianism, sort of somewhat deflated metaphysically, but not not completely. Oh, and I didn't mention Rand, but she's kind of a virtue ethicist, and has yet a different metaethical position. Though exactly what that is controversial, but it's anyways different from those other ones. Now you're still muted.
Yeah, I forgot. So I was saying that it seems like a pretty broad range of theories. Do you think there's any, I guess, metaethical theories that rule out, like which ones would rule out virtue ethics, where it just doesn't leave any room for virtue ethics at all?
I'm not sure. I mean, when I think of the major metaethical positions and the major sort of ethical theories, um, by and large, they're fairly able to mix and match. So you could be yeah, I can't think of it. Given, I mean, if Hume can be a virtue, if Hume and Aquinas can both be virtue ethicists, it's hard to know what couldn't be. I mean, I suppose if you were a complete metaethical nihilist, I mean, it's hard. Some people think Hume is a metaethical nihilist, and it's hard to know exactly what to say about Hume. But anyway, if someone who's more of a metaethical nihilist than Hume maybe couldn't be a virtue ethicist because they couldn't hold any ethical theory. But yeah, I think that when I think of the major metaethical positions and the major ethical theories, you can find people filling pretty much every box.
Do you want to expand a bit on your naturalist viewpoint? I'd be interested in hearing you elaborate a little more on your particular metaethical theory. Then, now that you've talked about some of the others.
Okay, so there's this So there's something that, I mean, Plato and Aristotle and Aquinas are all doing something similar, but with important differences. So, Plato's got the form of the good, which, depending on how you understand it. I mean, if you deflated it a bit, I could sign on. But I think his version is fairly undeflated. He thinks that there's such a property as goodness itself, which is a separate thing in its own right, and that it's it's what backs up all value and really all causal explanation ultimately for him. So Aristotle finds that a bit much. So Aristotle wants to deflate that and say, oh no, all you need for value is you've got, well, at least living beings. I mean, I think he thinks that there's value in addition to living things, but primarily, living things have natures, essences that have that have certain conditions of fulfillment, and you don't need something like the form of the good. Now, Aristotle's metaphysics of his metaphysical biology, to use Alistair McIntyre's term for it, is probably a little too metaphysically robust for me, if that's the right way to put it. It's static. You can't have species changing. He thinks species are stuck throughout all time, and so forth. So I don't want to sign on to something like that, but I do think the basic idea that our structures as living beings, the way that we're organized in such a way that a proper understanding of our nature commits us to certain ways of thinking about what our ultimate goals are and so forth. I find that approach attractive. Now, things I like from Aquinas too. Now, Aquinas, again, he's closer to Plato in that he's got a form of the good that's actually a person, and well, maybe it's a person. I mean, it's hard to know because he's got this analogical stuff where, but anyway, he's got this idea that being and goodness are the same property, and I think there's something to that. Again, it's all too metaphysically heavily freighted for me, but I think that the core idea is that something can be more or less fully what it is. Something can sort of more fully or less fully express its nature, and this idea, and I think that's a helpful way of thinking about virtue ethics.
So I guess just to push on that a little, why don't you think that? I mean, I feel like a lot of people instinctual response to that would be, well, is that admitting maybe the naturalistic fallacy, or is that trying to get an off from it is? And I feel like those criticisms are leveled at Rand a lot too, which I see some similarities. So why don't you think those criticisms are kind of on point? What's wrong? Where do people go wrong there?
Okay, well, I mean, if the idea is that you can't get an ought from it is just that from a bunch of purely descriptive premises you can't get a normative conclusion, I think that's right. But I think that at least the way I want to approach it is as agents we start on the outside. So it's not that we start on the inside and have to somehow find our way across to the outside. As agents, we start with, you always got some goal or other if you're an agent. And the idea, and this is something I think Kant was right about, although I don't like much of the way he did it in practice. But the general idea is if you've got any goals at all, and I think Socrates is doing something similar. If you've got any goals at all, then those goals plus facts about your nature can cause you to specify your goals or even shift your goals in ways you didn't anticipate. But you start off, so you start off with some goal or other. But so the most obvious way you can do this is you start off with a goal, and then you have facts about the means to your goal, and then that gets you, another goal. But given that for Plato and Aristotle, in addition to means that are causal or instrumental means to the end, you also have means that are constituents of the end. So sometimes pursuing the means to the end is not so much a matter of figuring out which things will cause the end, as figuring out how to specify the end. So you start off with some very generic end, but then facts about your nature and so forth may cause you to specify that end more concretely in ways that you might not initially have have thought. Just so it's like means-end reasoning, except that it's where the means and end are related as part to whole rather than as cause to effect.
So you're saying a lot about appealing to like natures and stuff. I mean, so you obviously embrace some sort of human nature. What do you think that kind of entails, or what do you think human nature is?
Okay, well, I mean there are several different ways of thinking about human nature that I think all have some important bit of the truth. So, including the views that deny human nature. The views that deny human nature, I think, are onto something, because they're denying a certain conception of human nature. The idea that there's this, this fixed thing that somehow is separate from us and is some kind of external constraint on our agency, and so forth. So both Sartre and Foucault, in different ways, deny human nature. Although, for Sartre, the absence of a human nature sort of becomes its own nature in a way. But anyway, I think they both have useful things to say. But I think that you can find sort of deflated conceptions of human nature that aren't vulnerable to their objections. When Aristotle talks about uses these biological concepts, I don't think that the best way to develop those today is in terms of the empirical science of biology, for the most part. I don't think we get that much in the way of values from that. Although I think that there's this distinction in Austrian economics between praxeology and themology, or praxeology has to do with those aspects of human action that are sort of a priori categories of means and ends and so forth. You can grasp a priori. They're conceptual truths about action. And then themology has to do with psychological stuff about, and which is often empirical, about understanding the particular desires people have. And then below that, there's just stuff about neurophysiology. Well, I think there's something analogous in that. In addition to sort of the empirical facts about our squishy organs and so forth in biology, there are also some biological categories that are kind of like praxeological categories. There's a nice book on this by Michael Thompson called Life and Action. I don't buy everything in the book, but he points out that there are these there are these sort of conceptual categories that we have for applying to living things that can't be derived from empirical biology, but they can't coherently be denied either. And so that's the kind of thing I think Aristotle is doing. And in a way, it's like Kant. Except that Kant doesn't do it. Kant doesn't do it with biology. And Kant has things to say about biology, but they're all sort of, that's all third critique stuff. It's not part of the ethics. But in Kant's ethics, he's trying to find sort of what the conceptual structures are in action that carry normative weight. So I think you can do something like that, but you also bring in facts about the way we have to think of our sort of metabiological nature.
Okay, interesting. So I guess moving on a bit from the ethics, I have a question from Christopher Richard Hudson Jr. And he wants to ask, which aspects of Ayn Rand should young libertarians abandon, and which aspects should they take more seriously?
Okay, well, I think Rand's biggest flaw is a kind of rigidity, a kind of taking the stuff she'd worked out and then sort of circling the wagons around it and saying this is everything. Nothing needs to be seriously reconsidered or worked on anymore. They can fiddle with the details, but I've got it all definitely and definitively worked out. And she worked this out during a period where she wasn't really in dialogue with many people who weren't her disciples. Now that's partly her fault and partly their fault, because mainstream philosophers didn't really want to have much to do with her. On the other hand, she had very little patience for them. It was kind of a mutual failing. But it's sort of I mean, in a way, I think it's the same problem as with the the reason the Star Wars prequels are often not as good as the original is that when George Lucas was making the original ones, he was getting feedback from Spielberg and Coppola and all these people because he wasn't and even from Mark Hamill in the very first Star Wars movie. There's a scene where he wanted, when Luke finds his aunt and uncle dead, he wanted Mark Hamill to yell "No!" and Hamill said, well, that sounds kind of dumb. Can't I just stand there looking stunned instead? And Lucas said, okay. So, but by the time that he did the prequels, he was the George Lucas, and he wasn't really listening to anyone anymore. So I think that's something similar with Rand. When she's first starting out, she allowed some input. She talked to Isabel Patterson and so forth. But later on in her career, she just wasn't really taking any more input, and therefore, she ended up with something that she thought was very thoroughly worked out when it wasn't. So, in addition to sort of worries about specific positions she might have had, I think just that attitude is something to avoid. It's something to avoid, not just if you're, if you're Ayn Rand, but for any particular school of thought, whether it's Austrian economics or anything. It's a mistake to think that you've got everything so worked out that you really just don't need to take feedback seriously from the outside. I think that the best thing to take from Rand is she has this this marvelously inspiring vision, and there's a lot of subtlety and nuance, particularly in the fiction. There's a lot of subtlety and nuance that sometimes doesn't make it into the nonfiction as clearly. But there's I think she does the same thing that Plato was trying to do in the dialogues with presenting Socrates. So Plato's got this implausible view that Rand, in her way, has too, which is there's no conflict between morality and self-interest. And one of the things I think that Plato wants to do, and I think this is one of the reasons he writes dialogues, is Plato dramatizes that in the character of Socrates. It's easier to believe, and to see how morality and self-interest might not conflict, the way that Socrates is presented. In a way where he doesn't seem like a goody two-shoes, and yet he also he seems like an attractive character you might want to emulate, but you can see how it works for him. Rand does something similar. I mean, her characters aren't that much like Socrates, but they're, they make concrete a conception of individualism that makes realistic how other people's how concern for other people's rights could be perfectly part of your own self-respect.
Interesting. So what do you think we shouldn't take from her then? What do you think we should leave behind?
Well, in addition to just sort of the general rigidity and dogmatism I was worried about, I think that when she passes from the fiction to the nonfiction, or I guess really beginning with Galt's speech, which was sort of the beginning of the nonfiction, when she tries to place her ethics on a philosophical foundation more explicitly, I think, and I've written about this in that book Reason and Value, which is allegedly supposed to be coming out in a reissue, but anyway, it's available in Kindle, and anyway, there are free versions available online. But in that, what I argue is that when she passes from the fiction to the nonfiction, she starts coming up with a justification that is sort of too consequentialist, too instrumentalist, turns morality into some kind of strategy for maximizing your chances of survival. So that making quality of life a kind of indirect strategy for achieving quantity of life, which doesn't, I think, describe what her characters are doing. So she makes it too causal, too instrumental, as opposed to being more of a constitutive means. So I think that, so I think that's one of my main objections. When it comes to politics, I think, some of her failings there. First of all, I think that she, not consistently, but often, tends to, to overvalue the place of the capitalist head of the business, as it's sort of the idea that businesses are run by a single brilliant mind at the top who drags all the fools with him. I mean, not to say that there's never any element of that, but it's, she had this kind of vision of titans of industry striding across the landscape, and tended to make her you know, overestimate the extent to which those hierarchical structures are products of the free market. Now, sometimes she talks as though that's the whole story, and talks about big business being an oppressed and persecuted minority. There are other passages where she seems to recognize more the role of cronyism and corporatism in lots and lots of existing business, but she had this kind of emotional attachment to this this capitalist vision. Also, of course, the fact that she maintained an allegiance to the idea of the American state, well, to the state as such, not being an anarchist, but also particularly this vision she had of the American state as being, particularly in foreign policy, being a virtuous actor, or when it departed from virtue, by being too altruistic. That was the problem with the Vietnam War, she thought, was that we were too altruistic and sacrificing ourselves to help people over there, which I don't think is a full description of what happened in that war. Then on sort of social and cultural issues, she's mixed. I mean, in some ways she was very good, in some ways awful, sometimes on the same issues depending on the mood. I mean, her her rants against feminism and homosexuality and so forth are depressing, although in many ways she was a feminist pioneer herself. But and in many ways it was also part of the increasing rigidity. Is a lot of the bad stuff becomes stronger later. I don't want me to suggest that she just consistently got worse over the course of her career, because I think that she, in some respect, got better in that in her she became I think that she had this early Nietzschean phase, and it's not clear how literally she took it, but it's sort of the rhetoric of there are just a few great people who are sort of predestined to greatness, and everyone else could just be their servants. And then she comes to this more libertarian, more equal-based view. In fact, the Fountainhead is sort of her attempt to liberate herself from that early position. But on the other hand, she, for example, she, in one of the early drafts of We the Living, she has this description of abstract art and how liberating it was to see these playful, free shapes coming in from the West. It was so unlike the Soviet art. Because later on, she's very hostile to abstract art. And that's just, it's a minor thing, but it's one of the ways in which she seemed in some ways more open-minded early on, and starts fighting sort of a rearguard action version of the culture war later. So there's a lot of good and a lot of bad. So just I think it's a mistake to sort of read her just through the lens of only the good stuff or only the bad stuff, even though those are still the two most common ways of reading her, I think. Not as bad as it used to be.
What is your favorite book by her? I'm curious.
Oh, that's tricky. I mean, Atlas Shrugged was the first one I read, and so it probably influences me. Plus, given the fact that I grew up out west, and so much of that, she wouldn't approve of this as a reason, because it was a random autobiographical reason. But all the stuff about the trains zooming out over the west, and the the locations in Colorado and so forth out there. That's one reason I liked it. But it's of the main three, it's sort of whichever one I'm reading at the moment. Each of them has something that the other ones don't have.
If Rand were alive today and you could only had to ask her one question, what would it be?
Oh man, that's tricky.
Do you want to circle back around to that?
Yeah, maybe.
Okay. Next, so there's a user in the chat. Nick. So Nick Ford wants to ask, what example of thick libertarianism has fascinated you the most?
Has what me the most?
Fascinated you.
Oh, fascinated me the most.
So by example, I guess he's referring to the 5 kinds of thickness, or maybe maybe however you interpret that. Give us your answer.
Well, given my sort of given my Aristotelianism, I guess the version of application thickness that's sort of a specification thickness, that you need certain values to, you have some generic conception of the natural law, and you need certain values to narrow it down to something more specific. Since that sort of fits in with the whole constitutive mean stuff and so forth, I guess I kind of like that. But I don't know whether that's what he's asking, or whether he's asking for some particular.
In the chat, he just wrote, "No, I meant a particular figure, like how they square libertarianism with certain commitments." Oh, I think he's talking about a person. Maybe yourself.
I don't find myself endlessly fascinating. Maybe Charles.
Well, for the viewers at home who don't know, I'm assuming you're talking about
Charles Johnson.
Not Charles Manson or Charles.
Well, they're very similar. They're both,
Charles Manson, Charles Johnson.
They're radical thinkers, and
just a bunch of crazy guys. Okay. So moving on, someone else in the chat who I believe is just Max Lefebvre in disguise wants to ask, what do you think of Michael Huemer's ethical intuitionism that's become really popular lately, and do you think it's compatible with virtue ethics? Do you think you can get a virtue ethics out of an intuitionist framework?
Okay, well, I think you've already said we can get virtue ethics out of anything. So here's what I like and what I don't like about the intuitionism. So what I like is, I think that it fits in broadly with my approach to epistemology, which is that you can, which is this kind of Aristotelian approach. You can start off with the things that initially seem plausible and then work out their implications. You don't have to start with some kind of axiom and derive everything from it in order to be justified in believing things. But where I tend to disagree with him is, so there's this line which I think comes from him. Brian Kaplan's fond of quoting it, but I think it's from Huemer, like many of the things that Brian's fond of quoting. Is that he doesn't like what he calls deriving the clear from the obscure, or something like that. So he doesn't like arguments that start with something more controversial than the conclusion and use it to establish the conclusion, which of course lots of philosophers do. So they're trying to prove something like, you shouldn't kill people or something, but they'll start off with the categorical imperative, or the existence of God, or human nature, or something more controversial than the conclusion, and he thinks that's a mistake. But the reason that I don't think that's a mistake is I don't think that the purpose of those arguments is just to get you to believe the conclusion. I think it's often to explain why the conclusion is true. And for Mike, it often seems as though, I don't know whether this is sort of consistently or solely his view, but it often seems as though the purpose of these philosophical arguments is just to prove that something is true. But I think, philosophically, I already know that I shouldn't murder people. I'm not that concerned with trying to prove that. But I'm interested in why it's true, and explaining why something's true. You often have to appeal to something less plausible. Just like the law of gravity is a lot less plausible than the fact that apples fall and the moon doesn't, which is what Newton was using it initially to explain. So I guess that would be my reservations. I think that it just wants you to leave you with the that and not with the why.
Okay. So moving on, there's a question from Twitter from, I think the username is @CrossOfCrimson. They have a few questions. I'll try to ask some of them.
I know that I can't remember who that is, but I know that person, but I've forgotten which of the people I know that is. But anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So maybe they're questions will be interesting. I think there. What is so? I'll go with this one. On your Aristotelian view, does drug use become a vice only at certain points, or do its properties make it, in terms of diminishing one's rational capacities, make it immoral all the time?
Um, I'm inclined to think that it's that it's a matter of degree. I mean, you can, I mean the level of our the level of our rational clarity sort of rises and falls over the course of the day. I don't think you have an obligation to keep it at absolute maximum at every moment. Rand may have thought that. I don't know if she did, but I don't think so. But it seems to me that so I mean, the only drug I really indulge is alcohol, and I don't indulge it much. I've never been drunk. Do I think it's immoral to be drunk? I don't have a firm view on that. I think it would be immoral to sort of spend a great deal of time drunk. I don't find being drunk attractive, and that's why I haven't done it. But I'm not prepared to say with certainty that it's always wrong to be drunk. It's to borrow a line from Foucault, it's maybe falls not so much in the category of the forbidden as the category of the dangerous.
So how do you then? I mean, I've heard you make the argument a lot about, like you were saying earlier, your essence or nature being more or less fulfilled. I mean, so wouldn't that in this situation mean that the more time I spend at my maximum rational capacity, the more human I'm being, the more flourishing I'm getting, or does it not?
Well, I mean, I think that's broadly right, but so Aristotle has this idea that we need to live a human life, not the life of a beast or a god. But he thinks that a truly human life is going to be closer to the godlike life than to the beast-like life because it's more the rational part of us is dominant. But he says we shouldn't try to live as if we are disembodied intellects because we're embodied beings, and so the welfare of the body matters. So to be truly human, means that the rationality dominates. But it doesn't mean that sort of the bodily indulgences are aren't part of it. They have to be part of the whole thing. So it's what's important is being human more than just being rational, and being rational is sort of the centerpiece of being human. But it's not the whole of it. We're not just disembodied rational wills. Sorry, Kant.
Okay. So I have a question next from Wade Craig, who wants to ask, what do you think of, I'm going to butcher this philosopher's name. She's known for exemplarist virtue ethics. Zagzebski?
Oh, yeah, Linda Zagzebski.
Okay. He wants to know what you think of her version of virtue ethics.
I think, does she teach in Oklahoma?
I believe she does. I think that's, yeah.
Yeah, so she's, one of the things she's known for, she has she's tried to adapt virtue ethics to epistemology. And to say that, because a lot of epistemology is sort of like deontology, and it's very rule-oriented, rules for proper belief formation and justification and so forth. And she suggests a more virtue-oriented approach to epistemology, where it's you form justified beliefs by acting in ways that express cognitive virtues and that kind of thing. It's been a while since I read her book. I can't remember. I know I agreed with part of it and disagreed with part of it. I'm not sure which was which, but generally I think it's an interesting approach. I do recall that she thought she'd solved the Gettier problem, and a former colleague of mine convinced me that she hadn't. For those who don't know what the Gettier problem is, if I were to explain it, it would take too long. But you can look up the Gettier problem, Gettier. Look it up on Wikipedia, and then you want to know what I'm talking about. After that, you can email me. But otherwise, to explain the Gettier problem would take up too much of this podcast.
Okay. So all right. So moving on then to so I have a question from Cooper Williams. He asks, often people make bad decisions without the prior experience or knowledge necessary to avoid such a decision. Without appealing to acrasia or the weakness of the will, how can we criticize those who make such decisions? Must one do bad things to become a good person?
Okay, so I'm trying to think of what kind of actions they have in mind. So cases where, you know, all right, so you do bad things. I mean, there are things for which you may have, diminished responsibility. So let's say, since they didn't give an example, I'm not entirely sure what they have in mind. I'll make up an example. Suppose that you were raised by, by people with very mistaken moral views on a lot of stuff, and when you first, when you're first growing up, and you're very busy, you don't have a lot of time for reflection, you haven't had much experience, you haven't met people or other perspectives, so it's natural that you'll believe a lot of crap, and it seems like you're not blameworthy initially. And I think that as time passes, particularly if you have time to reflect, although people vary in how much time they have, and if you're if you're working if you're working from dawn till dusk, manual labor, it might be difficult. Um, but I think that you wouldn't necessarily be morally culpable initially before you've had time to reflect, and in holding bad views and therefore acting on them. They'd still be mistaken views, and I think that you can be I think you can have vices that you're not morally responsible for. And so you wouldn't be morally blameworthy for them, but they still would be there'd still be an ethical problem. I think typically we are at least partly responsible for our vices, but you could, in principle, develop vices that aren't your fault. So we wouldn't be blaming you for it, but I think there are ethical categories broader than than blame. And you can still say, all right, well then, it's like being, morally unhealthy, as a sort of an analog of, or maybe even an instance of being psychologically unhealthy, and your responsibility for that may vary. Anyway, that's my best stab at. Since I wasn't sure exactly what they had in mind, that's my best stab at.
Okay. So Wade also messaged me. He wants to follow up. He wants to know a little bit more. What do you think of exemplarism in particular? Not just her, but her theory of exemplarism. Do you buy that version of virtue ethics, I guess, or?
I don't remember it well enough to to say anything useful about it, alas.
Okay. So we'll move on to Nathan Goodman. Wants to ask, well, you're a left libertarian, you're involved with C4SS and everything. He wants to ask, what do left libertarians claim about changes in firm size and structure in a free market? And are those claims stronger than the evidence warrants?
He already knows the answer to these questions. All right, so.
Well, yes, but everyone else wants to hear.
Yeah. Oh, comrade, is it true that the production at Smolensk is blah blah blah? Okay, so all right, so the claim is that that government regulation, and this is one of the main defenders of these positions is Kevin Carson. The claim is that government regulation tends to make firms larger and more hierarchical and smaller in number, thus less competitive than they would be in a freer market, because first of all, there are various kinds of regulations that tend to make it easier to deal. You could deal with more easily if you're already an established player. Various regulatory hoops and licensing and so forth that makes it hard for you to rise up. But the few that manage to rise up, therefore, face a fairly uncompetitive field. Then there are various kinds of subsidies, both direct and indirect. And Kevin particularly likes talking about transportation subsidies that make big companies like Walmart, his favorite. It partly pays their transportation costs, and the idea is that when getting bigger makes you more productive, it also increases your distribution costs. But transportation highway subsidies make those make it so that we're partially subsidizing their transportation costs. Another example, this isn't so much from Kevin, I forget who I got this from, some British economist, pointed out that taxation, the transactions between firms are taxed. Typically, transactions within firms aren't. So it's another reason to move stuff in. So these are all things that tend to make firms larger. Also, to the extent that they're insulated from price competition, it makes it easier for them to be hierarchical. He thinks hierarchy is inefficient because information travels badly downward and even less well upward, and you get a kind of Hayekian or Misesian calculation problem within the firm. And anyway, so those are some of the reasons for thinking that in a freer market, the firm, the way I put it is that the field would be, the firms would be smaller, flatter, and more crowded. There'd be more of them, and that there'd be more individual proprietorships, more workers' co-ops, and so forth. Now, what critics often ask is, well, yeah, there are various regulations that make things, easier for the corporate elite, but also various things that make it harder for them too. And there are subsidies for small businesses as well, and various things. And so, why should we expect the free market to be that different? And for me, the answer just is, if you just look at the total number, so no one should believe me that just based on what I just said, because I didn't say that much, but read through some of the left libertarian literature. Just look at the sheer number and size and all pervasiveness of the various regulations, and I haven't even talked about banking. The various regulations that tend to favor smaller numbers of larger players and more hierarchical firms. You just look at the total number of those things and how all pervasive they are in the economy. It's hard to believe that removing them wouldn't make a difference, and they really seem much more all pervasive than the ones that go the other way. So that's my answer.
All right. Moving on to, there's two questions from Michael Zigismund from Facebook. He asks, what classical liberal documents that are still untranslated are you excited about sharing with English readers? So you do a lot of translating of older works on your site. So are there any upcoming or any in the works?
Yeah, I've got ones I want to do. I just need to find the time to do them. But the mainly French, since that's the language I can best handle. So the stuff from Charles Comte, Charles Dunoyer, and Augustin Thierry. They're the three guys who ran the Censeur, or later the Censeur Européen, the magazine that was sort of the founding of libertarian class theory, and that stuff that I want to do. There's more stuff from Gustave de Molinari. He wrote many books. I'd like to translate more stuff from there. There's Anselme Belgarrigue. Sean Wilbur has translated a fair bit of his stuff, but there's still some stuff that I'd like to translate. He wrote this thing on called Women of America, which is absolutely insane. So I don't want to translate it because I agree with it, but it's a pro-feminist work, but it's such a weirdly pro-feminist work that I think most feminists would rightly reject it. But it's just interesting. It's very short, and I'd like to translate that. There's some other French liberal thinkers I'd like to do something with. But those four are sort of the main ones. So they had, so the first three had a bunch of articles in the Censeur. Dunoyer also had this big treatise, which he released under three different titles, of three different editions. Industry and Morals was the title of the first one. And Charles Comte has the treatise on property and treatise on legislation. Thierry had a piece on nations. I don't know whether to call it a long article or a short book. I think I've got that halfway translated and just haven't had time to finish the rest of it. But those are sort of the four main guys I want to get back to.
Cool. Looking forward to that stuff. Another question from Max Lefebvre. So a couple of years ago, you did this 10-part series at Mises University, and it's online, and everyone should go check it out. It's called what is it? The moral foundations of libertarian ethics. I think is what the video. It's like a 10.
I think it's just called the Foundations of Libertarian Ethics. I sometimes called it the Praxeological Foundations, but I think the official title was just the Foundations of Libertarian Ethics.
Okay. So Max wants to know, you're working on making that into a book? Is that right? And are you going to extrapolate on any certain points, or is it going to be straight?
I'm transcribing it. It goes slowly because A, I don't have that much time, and B, because listening to my own voice is tiresome. But yeah, I have been transcribing that. I hope over the break to do more. Although I have another book project that I have to finish by December 19th, so I'll be focusing more on that. But
We know what that. Can you tell? Are you allowed to tell us?
it's this introduction to Aristotle that I have a contract for, but that's when I absolutely need to finish the goddamn thing. But after that, I hope to spend some time, transcribing that thing. I'm not planning to elaborate on it because I will eventually, write again on those subjects more fully. But mainly, my goal is just to get the lectures into print and worry about it. Because if I start revising them, I just revise them and revise them and revise them and have to stop. There isn't one of them this long back and forth I had trying to work out something. And I now think I was just confused, and so I'm going to have a footnote saying, ignore all this crap. But I'll put all the crap in there. I want the document in there. So that, so I should be publishing that early next year, I think.
Cool, very cool. All right, so we have a few minutes left. I got also a question on Twitter from Angela Keaton, who actually was on SFL Live last week or a few weeks ago, and she spoke also at the Denver conference last weekend, which you were at. She wants to know, why do you hate America?
She taught me to.
All right, good answer. She taught a lot of people how to hate America. Awesome. All right, so just to wrap up, can you? I want to talk about the Oklahoma conference this weekend. Do you want to tell us what you're briefly what you're talking about a little bit?
Okay, yeah. All right, so I'm talking about the idea of anarchy as a kind of constitutionalism. So that is where you could think of it as an extension of checks and balances, rather than just sort of being political structurelessness, which a lot of people think. And I'm also going to be replying, and people who've read my stuff, know this bit of mine, but I'm replying to this this idea a lot of objectivists have of the problem with anarchy being the absence of a final arbiter. And so partly what I say is, well, look, if by a final arbiter you mean something or some institution or process that absolutely guarantees that conflicts get resolved without remainder, then all right, sure, anarchy doesn't have that, but no system has it. And if by a final arbiter you just mean some set of institutions that makes it the case that conflicts are likely to get resolved more or less most of the time, then government has that, but anarchy has that too. And I also talk about this idea that people think of when people are worried about doing without government, they think of government as some kind of structure external to human behaviors. You've got all these people in society interacting, and then there's a structure around them that makes them, holds them in check. But there isn't any such thing. It's just us. It's the existence of government consists in human beings interacting. It isn't something over and above them, and so it's the patterns of human interaction are all we've got to constrain themselves. There's ultimately nothing external to it.
Awesome, very cool. I'm looking forward to that, and I know you have, because I know that was a paper of yours in a book you edited. I think.
It's a book called Minarchism/Anarchism or Anarchism/Minarchism. I forget which title comes first. That I co-edited with Tibor McCann. The subtitle is Government Part of a Free Country? It's oddly worded. I didn't pick that subtitle. I can't remember if Tibor picked that or whether the publisher picked it. But anyway, it's a bunch of articles, pro and con. Several of our well, Charles Johnson has a piece in there. Does any of our our group, CFRS group. Maybe those are the only two CFRSSers. I forget.
I think it's yours on constitutionalism and Charles, and everyone should go look up. I don't think the book is free, but I've been able to access your essay from it. I think it's on praxeology.net.
Well, and I know that the whole manuscript was floating around online somewhere. I don't know if it's still available free now, but I remember finding it in the past. And if someone can't find it and they want to see it, drop me a note. I can probably find it for you.
Awesome. Very cool. So we are, I guess, going to wrap up. It's about 10 o'clock. Let me just say a little bit about the conference this weekend. It's on Saturday, November 14th. It's at the University of Oklahoma. Totally free. Just put on by Students for Liberty. Just totally student-run conference. And you get some free meals and an awesome social afterwards. And there's a bunch of great speakers. There's Roderick, of course. Also, I'll have a quick talk. Nathan Goodman, who asked a question, will be talking a bit. Also, Charles Johnson, who was mentioned, will be speaking. Per Byland, who's I think teaches there, and also David Friedman. So going to be a lot of fun at that conference, a lot of anarchism. So, well, thank you, Roderick. I really appreciate you.
Hey, do you want to plug any upcoming podcasts or interviews?
Oh yeah, I'm the one supposed to be remembering that. So thank you for reminding me. So on Liberty.me's end, more podcasts coming up. Tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern is Unbiased America with Mary Ruwert, who is a pretty interesting libertarian figure. 8 o'clock tomorrow night is We the Individuals with Walter Block. So tomorrow night there will be tons of interesting conversations with some libertarians, Walter and Mary Ruwert. So thank you, Roderick, and thanks everyone for watching. Hopefully we'll see you at the Oklahoma conference this weekend. So good night. Take care, everyone.
Sure. Good night.